low testosterone. It's a big problem. Talk about the top things that can go wrong in the male body when our testosterone gets too low, which, by the way, many people are in this bracket right now.
Yeah, so there's so many reasons why our hormones are critical for us. And for the male body, testosterone is one of the most important hormones for a variety of different benefits, health aspects, across some of the things we think about immediately, right? So we think about sexual health, we think about strength of erection, sexual performance, we think about libido, drive for sexual performance. We think obviously about muscle mass and the ability to gain muscle, to work out, and to have your body sustain muscle easily. And we think also about, some of the less known effects might be, effects on mood, effects on irritability, and effects on cognition, effects on being able to think clearly, have your brain work optimally, right? And so, and then obviously some of the other things that we don't necessarily think about as much, and if you really dive into the research, testosterone and optimal hormone balance has an incredibly important role in a huge variety of chronic illnesses. So cardiovascular health, our heart, our cholesterol, our blood pressure, even, the ability for, our body to maintain adequate bone mass and bone density, the ability for our body to maintain blood levels, anemia, et cetera. So really an interesting variety of different, important factors, which I'm excited to dive in more detail today.
We have a graph here, and this has been taken from the European Urology Journal. Can you explain a little bit of this graph of the decline in testosterone? And the data is very similar. We also have a link in the show notes for the Urology Times, showcasing a journal that was there on testosterone. Can you describe here a little bit of what you're seeing from 1999 to 2000, all the way up to 2015 and 2016 in terms of the decline of testosterone?
Yeah, so what this graph shows us, it shows us three different colored bars for different age groups of men, and it shows us the average testosterone levels for those groups across different year spans, decades, et cetera. And what we can see is a pretty clear and pretty linear decrease of testosterone in each age group across time. And I think that if we take a step back and we look at the 30,000-foot view on this, from everything that we talk about from a functional medicine point of view, this makes sense. And it's also scary at the same time, right? Because what we're seeing is that there are many, many different factors that have a role in our optimal balance, in our optimal physiological functioning across any and all body systems. But what we're seeing here specifically is the changes in this hormone testosterone, which again is vital for our health, for men and women's health. And we're seeing that across the years. And so we can unpack this a bit, and we can kind of think about, what are some of those factors that might be at play. But, as we were discussing prior to starting the recording, we're thinking about things like, stress. We're thinking about sleep disruption. We're thinking about artificial light exposure. We're thinking about toxins. We're thinking about there's a whole variety of different factors from an integrative and functional medicine point of view that play into this one question of our hormones, of our testosterone. So super important.
You said the word scary. Let's talk about that for a second before we unpack the top drivers that are driving down testosterone, not just in men, but also in women too, but in particular in men. Why is this scary? What's scary about it when you look at it from the lens of a medical doctor?
Yeah, so if you look at it just from the lens of testosterone, you might think, wow, that's not good. I don't want my hormones to be lower. I don't want my testosterone to be lower. We might have some men out there who are listening to this and say, hey, I want good testosterone. Like, what am I going to do to make it better? But again, if you take a wider picture lens, like the testosterone really is just the symptom here. And it's a symptom of the fact, pretty indisputable fact, that we are living pretty far out of balance from our evolutionary history and what our bodies have known over tens of thousands of years, right? Like what they've, the information that's been fed to our physiology, to our cells, to our genes. And over the last, 30, 40, 50 years, we have dramatically changed that information that's going into our bodies and informing our cells and our genetics. And it's happening from the, preconception even, right? So, when men and women are getting ready to have a baby, their set point, their epigenetic set point, their inflammatory set point, what are their cytokines, what are their stress levels, what's going on with their gut, all that then feeds into the epigenetic programming of the baby when it's in utero, all the way up through childhood, and then you add on sort of all the environmental factors. So it's really, I say scary because it's really reflective of some pretty deep imbalances that we have going on at a global level.
By far, it seems to be, when people talk about the number one thing driving lower testosterone rates for men in particular, it seems to be that obesity is the primary thing that people talk about. Would you say that's true?
I would say obesity is definitely a very, very important factor for sure. One of the top factors, maybe top three. There's a lot of mechanisms there. There's, basically if you have obesity, you have more fat cells, and the fat cells are their own endocrine organs secreting estrogen. And then you have, insulin resistance, you have blood sugar dysregulation, you have metabolic syndrome, prediabetes, diabetes, diabesity, it's been called. I like that term. But that inflammatory milieu absolutely affects our hormones and testosterone specifically. But it's not just obesity, right? It's all of the factors that sort of are this ball of yarn that we try to pull apart in our functional medicine work, in our practice, because it's the sleep and it's the stress and it's the toxins and all these things that we're talking about today, which all play into with each other, right? So it's all kind of this constant cross communication happening.
If you had to put a number 2 and a number 3 and sort of rank them in order, and we're going to pull all these apart, we're going to go deep into all of them. But if you had to say if there was a number 2 driver of low testosterone levels, because it seems to be that this decline, we're in the almost 600s, at least for men in the category of 20 to 29, and even for men that are in the 30 to 40-year-old age group, they're in the upper 500s, close to 600. And then there's this massive drop where 40-year-olds are closer to 400 when you start to get to 2015 and 2016. And that's obviously not even the most recent data. Who knows what's happened since the pandemic and everything else. So if you had to put a number 2 primary driver that was there in our sort of modern industrialized world, what would you say that would be?
So if we can bury metabolic in with obesity and have that be one category.
Well, I think that's worth talking about a little bit,
because
exactly. Sometimes people just think, well, obesity is just your overweight, but it's so much more than that.
Yeah.
So if you want to tease out that aspect of metabolic.
Yeah. So, you can have, so with obesity, you have excess fat, and that becomes its own endocrine organ. And then you have, issues and imbalances that start to happen early on, even pre-weight gain, that start to happen with regards to blood sugar regulation, right? So you start getting swings of blood sugar, you start getting insulin resistance. The pancreas can't respond as well, it can't produce the insulin, but then the cells also become, sort of turning off that signal because the insulin, levels have been historically high. There's a huge feedback mechanism that happens there. But prior to that, you also can have a situation where, those processes are in place before the fat is on the body, right? And so, again, it's a feedback loop. It's a vicious cycle. And so, pre-weight gain or pre-significant weight gain, you can absolutely have blood sugar dysregulation, over secretion of insulin resistance, all these factors, inflammation, gut disruption, all these factors that then lead into the weight gain.
Yeah, you said vicious cycle, and I think that's important for people to see, because especially as you get older, we know that testosterone tends to decline, especially if you're not practicing a lot of the habits that you teach your patients at your clinic. By the way, can you just mention your clinic for those individuals that are curious?
Yeah, sure. I'm the founder and director of the California Center for Functional Medicine.
Amazing. So if you are not practicing these lifestyle habits, if you're not addressing low testosterone levels, testosterone will decrease over age and will lead to all these things. Just going back to your list: low energy, low libido, difficulty in putting on lean muscle mass, having a hard time focusing, and then the long-term issues that are connected to a whole host of things, but especially longevity in the form of increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Yeah. So the vicious cycle piece that I think is important to chat about is that as you get older and you're not in your sort of prime of young genetics, kicking in, Your low testosterone, largely driven by lifestyle, and then of course secondary factor being, age, as it goes down, it makes it easier for you to gain weight. And the more weight you gain, the lower your testosterone becomes. And that's the vicious cycle you're talking about. Played into also the other aspects of metabolic health.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think one thing that's important for us to point out also is that, if we show this kind of a graph, and we show this decline in testosterone over the years, that there's part of this is just a natural process, right? It is testosterone drops 1% to 2% every year, starting in your 20s, basically. So, there's a significant drop in testosterone over time. And we can talk about also, you'll see increase of this binding protein called sex hormone binding globulin, which increases gradually over time. And that will bind up some of that testosterone, so it won't be available for your cells, right? So some men might think, okay, well, it's just, part of, it's just kind of hopeless and I don't have anything I can do about it, but then we show this data, which shows that there's a pretty clear drop from external factors, on our bodies. And so what we really think about, when we're doing this work, when we're doing functional medicine work, we tend to throw a lot of testing at people. We tend to throw a lot of protocols, a lot of, we make people work, right? It's not always easy. We're super interested in finding how to do this more easily and how to help people and give them the support with coaching and nutrition and, a variety of different practitioners, et cetera, and data and wearables and all these things that help. But you do have to kind of show up and you have to do some work. But what gets exciting for me is that when we start to list out all of the different factors, that could be contributing to this, year on year, decade on decade drop of hormones, increase of stress in our bodies, there's so much that we can be doing. So there's so many. I like to just think of each one of these things like a lever that we can pull, right? There's so many different levers that if you're willing to dig in and to do a little bit of work and you want to optimize kind of how you're feeling right now, and you want to feel your best, you want to live your best life, but you also want to, live your best life for 10 years from now and for 20 years from now and for 30 years from now. And you want to increase your health span, how long you live in a healthy state compared to lifespan, right? So you want to do all those things. You want to think preventively. You want to, potentially set yourself up for the optimal and longest life possible. It's worth doing the work now, and it's worth doing the work and digging in and figuring out what are those levers that you can pull on to make a difference.
That's well said. Okay, let's keep going down the list of things that you feel that are ranked in order of whether it's the top 3, top 5 that are driving these low levels of testosterone that we're seeing and that we're pointing out on these graphs. So you mentioned sort of obesity and metabolic health kind of being number 1.
Yeah. So obesity, metabolic, I would put, I think sleep disruption is a huge one. I think chronic stress is a huge one. I think chronic gut disruption is a huge one. I would probably just list those quickly, and then probably environmental toxins.
So would you so even before stress,
I think sleep is bigger than stress.
Sleep is number 1, right?
Yeah, because with sleep, I would also bundle in artificial light exposure, so increased incidence of screen exposure over time.
Right, and one thing that was interesting is that as we brought up this graph, which again was from the European Urology, do you want to chat about?
Yeah, so we're looking at this. The biggest drop that you see on this graph is between 2003 to 2004 over to 2011 and 2012, right? When did you get your first cell phone?
I probably got my first cell phone. Well, I got my first cell phone in probably 1999.
Okay, so right, so just around the early 2000s. So I got mine probably 2000.
Okay,
but it was still like not. It was it was in a smartphone.
Yeah,
it wasn't a smartphone. It was a small screen. It wasn't a lot of light exposure. Right?
Yeah, my first smartphone was probably like early 2000s.
Yeah, same.
Yeah.
So, I'm sure that's not the only thing we're seeing, but it's pretty interesting that the biggest drop that we see, in this 25-year time span, or it's a 17-year time span for the purpose of this graph, because we don't have the most updated data. But it's pretty interesting that the biggest drop does occur, with much more widespread introduction of, mobile devices. So, it's one factor. Stress, I think increased during that time probably. And, I think that toxin exposure also increased, and, there's a variety of different factors. But yeah, curious.
Yeah, very curious. Toxin exposure. So you kind of listed that as, so number 1, you had obesity, metabolic health. Number 2, sleep disruption. Also put inside of that is screen time. And let's mention that for a second. Sleep, there's a whole aspect of that, right? You did an incredible deep dive that we'll link to on the podcast last time. It was like a 2.5-hour episode on sort of all things sleep. It was really fun. People still, I get emails about it all the time. So sleep, there's a few reasons why sleep could play into testosterone levels. Talk about some of those.
So testosterone is mainly secreted. It's under central control from the brain, signals from the hypothalamus down to the pituitary, and then down to the gonads and in the women ovaries and your adrenals also, right? For men, 95% of the testosterone is produced in the testicles, again, related to signals from the hypothalamus to the pituitary and then down to the testicles. The vast majority of our testosterone is secreted, between probably 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. So after we go to sleep, right? And it's similar for cortisol, right? So actually, cortisol is a little bit later. Cortisol tends to rise earlier in the morning and be at a lower stage when we're just going to sleep. But if you are, for whatever reason, not going to bed at that time, or you've been on your screens and you have disrupted sleep and you have a drop of, your HRV, heart rate variability, or an increase of your resting heart rate, showing signs of physiological stress on your body, or you had some alcohol, or you had a late meal, or whatever the factor is, right? You're stressed, your mind's going at 1,000,000 miles a minute. Whatever those factors are that contribute to poor sleep, those will, if you don't get proper sleep, or you're getting restless sleep or disrupted sleep or not enough sleep, or you're going to bed too late, you will not achieve the same release of testosterone in the body.
Why is this topic so important, especially for men in that sort of 40 plus category?
So the topic around sleep specifically, or
around testosterone in general?
Yeah. So I think that, one thing I always come back to in the work that we do, and I've been in functional medicine my entire career, even since I was in med school, even since I was an undergrad. And one thing I always come back to is how incredible our bodies are, right? They can do so much. They can put up with so much crap that we throw at them from all directions, right? Whether it's stress or sleep disruption or crappy food or air pollution or whatever it is, they just kind of keep going. But the ability to do that starts to kind of, fall apart, for lack of a better word, as we get into middle age and as we get even a little bit older, right? So when we're younger, it's like, we have a huge reserve and we can mostly keep going and we don't really notice it. We're kind of burning the candle at both ends. But really, as we get into late 30s, early 40s, certainly late 40s, early 50s, that starts to mount up. I think of it almost like barnacles, like we just accumulated a bunch of barnacles, and they start to add significant weight to our body and to our internal physiological equilibriums in terms of their ability to keep coming back to some degree of normal, quote unquote, right? And so after a while, and that's really the case for, I would say, most, if not all, chronic illness, where functional medicine really shines and Western allopathic medicine really struggles, because it's not like a quick fix. It's not like just here's a pill, here's this, surgery, here's some image, whatever. You can't, it's like a much more of a systems problem, right? Where you really have to figure out what are all these variables, how are they all playing with each other. And if you don't do that, again, you kind of feel like you're kind of a submarine slowly submerging underwater, right? And it can be subtle. You might not notice it week on week, month on month, year on year. But if you look at sort of how am I feeling, now I'm in mid 40s versus how was I feeling when I was in my mid 30s, you're like, wow, that's a big change, right? And you might just want to kind of scratch your head and write it off to normal aging. But I think what we're talking about today is that it doesn't have to be.
Yeah, a lot of what we see today is abnormal
stressed, accelerated aging. Yeah.
Let's talk about measuring testosterone, right? How do you look at it? If you're trying to get a sense, and what is the blood work and what are some of the associated blood work you take a look at, and give us a breakdown of some of the measurements of total testosterone, free testosterone, and if you have, what generally, average numbers are considered, and then what optimal numbers you like to see inside of a clinic.
Yeah. So again, labs are super important, and I'll dive into that, but it also has to be correlated with symptoms. How is somebody feeling? And so And that takes a little bit of teasing apart, especially in some men, because they might not be super aware of changes over time. Men
It's been a
tend to
long,
be,
slow decline, so
and
they don't know.
and they just tend to be men tend to be less like doers and fixers, and let's just get the job done and keep going, and they might not be as in tune, stereotypically with their bodies. But again, feeling down, feeling kind of blue, feeling overwhelmed, feeling irritable, starting to just get grumpy and it's like, can't, and obvious things like, it starts to really catch their attention when they start to have issues with erection strength or ejaculation strength or libido, just drive, just wanting to have sexual intercourse, et cetera. So, but then, in terms of labs, there's a number of different labs that you can run. And one of the pitfalls I would say for all of our listeners out there is if you are experiencing some symptoms that you're concerned about and you go to your doctor and they run a total testosterone test and the level comes back and, whatever the number is, let's say it's, 400, 500, it's in that normal range. And they tell you you're fine. It's not a testosterone problem. Maybe you're just depressed or maybe you just have, you're working too hard or whatever it is. Don't stop there. Because total testosterone is not the whole story. If you do that test and it's low, then you definitely have a low T problem.
And what is low?
So I would say, 300 or less, 300 nanograms per deciliter or less. If you're in the 200s, some people put that mark around 350 even. But if you're in the 200 range, I would definitely consider that to be low.
Yeah.
But if
even
you have
by classic measures, like even
Correct.
by traditional allopathic medicine, that's low.
Correct.
And of course, by functional standards and integrative standards, that's extremely low.
It's pretty nuanced, actually. Even from the functional medicine point of view, because what we don't always know, so it's kind of like N of 1 for each person, and we don't know because nobody ever runs their testosterone levels when they're 18. We don't really know what that individual man had as their normal. Right. So what was their baseline? Was there any comorbid issues, any chronic illness, chronic inflammation, gut disruption, et cetera, that was potentially lowering them from, what their potential was? Or at the very least, just sort of what's their set point, right? And what does their body expect as a normal testosterone level, right? But, so we can't just say, hey, let's just look at replacing everybody back to, the upper third of normal. Some doctors do that, which is not totally unreasonable. But some men, if they're replaced to the upper third of normal, will actually experience symptoms of too much testosterone, right? So you always have to be guiding by how does somebody feel? Number one most important thing. The symptoms, the patient, the person in front of us is the number one most important piece of information, and any lab data is secondary in any condition. Helpful, but secondary, with caveats helpful, right? So total testosterone, we talked about that, right? Again, if it's frankly low, you definitely have a low T issue and you should get some help. But it could also be in a relatively normal range, but you still could potentially have a problem. And so what we really want to look at there also is, and there's a long list of labs that we can talk about that are important. But in particular, you want to look at the free testosterone. And that's because that's basically, and you want to look at the sex hormone binding globulin, SHBG. So total testosterone, if you get that lab test, it gives you a number of how much testosterone is in your system, and that's going to give you bound testosterone, which is mainly there's two proteins which bind testosterone. There's SHBG, sex hormone binding globulin, and there's albumin. When the testosterone is bound to SHBG, it's a very tight binding. And that testosterone will not be released to have activity on the cells. And that can be up to 60% of the testosterone that's measured on that total testosterone test. Then there's testosterone that's bound to albumin, which is a weaker affinity. And so that can, sort of come on and off the albumin and have some effects on the cells. And then there's free testosterone. The percent bound to albumin is frequently around 40%. And there's free testosterone, which is really only 1 to 2% of that total testosterone, right? So you can have a relatively fine total testosterone level, but you can have a low free testosterone or low bioavailable testosterone, which is the combination of free plus what's bound to albumin. And so then you just don't have enough testosterone around in that case to have activity on the cells, right? So the total again can be deceptive if it's not.
It's only one part of the story, and that's the one that most people are familiar with. But working with the right practitioner can help you go a little bit deeper. Yep. So in terms of total, because that's the one that people are familiar with, where do you like to see things, especially let's talk about men, and then you can even throw in women as well too. I don't know if you have any, data that would be there. Of course you do, but for the purposes of this podcast to talk about or present, but where do you like to see total generally when we're talking about the optimal range, knowing that there's so many factors that are there, including if somebody's dealing with an infection or if their interleukin 6 is really high or other things. These are all things that can drive their testosterone down.
Yeah.
And somebody's baseline might be different than somebody else's.
Yeah.
But based on the population data, your clinical data, for somebody in their 40s, where would you generally like to see where they're at?
I personally, my preference is to at least have somebody be at the middle of the range or a little bit above. And, I don't necessarily need to, especially when you're repleting testosterone, I don't necessarily need to push people to the upper end of the range unless they just feel a lot better that way. But I do think it's important not to go a lot higher, because there are potentially risks to having too much testosterone around.
And so what would be the middle of the range if you just would add a number to it, looking at
I would
the
say,
classic?
400 to 600 nanograms per deciliter
Okay.
on a blood test.
Got it.
Yeah.
And then what about free testosterone? Where do you typically like to see that?
Similarly, yeah. So similarly, mid to upper third of the lab range is where my preference would be.
And typically that lab range is like 40s. It starts at like 40s.
It depends on the test. There's a couple of different tests. Yeah. So there's an analog test and there's a diffusion test, and so it kind of depends on which one you're running. Different doctors have different preferences, so you kind of have to go by the lab and kind of look at what's printed on the page in terms of the normal range and guide yourself from there. Another
one that you mentioned was free testosterone. So there's testosterone free, and I think they call it calc on a test, right?
Yeah.
What does that stand for?
Yeah. So the calculated, so there's ways to directly, like you run a blood test and you send it to the lab and you get a number back that says, this is your free testosterone.
Right.
And the main two ways, and it's a little bit disputed on sort of which one's quote better. There's analog free testosterone and there's equilibrium dialysis free testosterone. So those are like the two main methods that are out there. Pluses and minuses on both sides. The book Testosterone for Life, the Harvard doctor, he recommends analog as his main favorite. So those are, again, direct measurements, get the number back. The calculated free testosterone, you can calculate, basically, it's not a direct measurement of the testosterone. So you could basically take your lab range for your total testosterone, your SHBG, sex hormone binding globulin, and your albumin, and you put into an online calculator, and then it gives you a number for your free testosterone,
which is a percentage often.
It's a percentage, yeah. And it's a decent way of doing it. I personally do prefer to get a direct number back. It's just, I think it's, potentially more accurate. It's easier to use. It makes more sense to the patient in front of you. And you can use that if you're using the same lab over time, you can use that to track therapy too.
Yeah. And there's a few online calculators for free testosterone that people can type in and they can do it. I put my numbers into a calculator online and it came back as 1.72%, right? For my free testosterone percentage as sort of, based on the numbers that were placed in and what was calculated out.
And what's that? Do you know what the upper end of normal on that calculator was?
I think the upper, based on percentages. No, I'll have to go back and check.
Curious.
Yeah, I have to go back and check. But my total testosterone, which was really interesting to me, and I've shared a little bit with my past podcast guests as past episodes with the audience. In September of 2022, I got serious about adding, lean muscle mass, just from all my great conversations with guests on this podcast, including Dr. Gabrielle Lyon. And at the time, I was not seriously strength training. And I measured my testosterone, my total testosterone, and it came back as 507. I have some scattered sort of markers that were there previously, and but that was the one that I was kind of using as sort of the reference. So I was about like 507. And just by getting more serious about weight training, which I didn't do just to improve my testosterone levels, I did for a whole host of factors.
Look better, you feel better. Just
look better, feel better.
So important.
Longevity, better
blood sugar,
metabolic health, better blood sugar, everything. Yeah. From September 2022 to my retest, and I wasn't able to download all the reports. I got kind of cut off here, but just by looking at here on this sheet, June of this year. So 06, June of this year, I had increased my total testosterone by almost 50 points.
Nice.
Just through
10%.
Just through regular strength training, which of course improved my body composition as well.
Yeah.
I lost fat, I added in muscle. And it's just another reminder that, all these things that we do to improve our aspects of our health, they have multiple ramifications on our body.
Yeah. And
one of those being that my testosterone improved during that time as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that self-experimentation. And there's a pearl there too, so that's exactly what we tell patients, right? So a lot of times in our medical system, the patient wants to come into the doctor. The model in the Western system is go to the doctor, kind of drop your body off like you would a car at the mechanic, and like, hey, here, you fix it, and let me know when it's done, right? But there's so much ability to make these lifestyle changes and to positively affect your hormones, your testosterone, and a whole wide variety, a network effect of other things that's so important. So we actually, and a lot of practitioners, we don't actually, if a man comes to us and we, they're having symptoms or labs that show concerns around testosterone or other hormones, our first endeavor, our first, intervention are the lifestyle pieces, because we want to do a couple of things. One, we want to prime their body so that it's better able to then respond to and receive benefit from the treatments when we start them. And we also want to show them, hey, this is in your control. There's a good amount of stuff that you can do, those levers that we can pull on that are going to positively push us in the right direction. And some practitioners actually will not even prescribe testosterone replacement therapy unless a man is doing strength training, because of the synergy that happens there. So it's super important. I love that you did that experiment.
Yeah. And, sometimes I'll talk to my friends, not that comparison of total testosterone of me to my friends is the same thing, but I have noticed that my friends that, everybody probably ate not healthy when they were younger, especially if they grew up in kind of like, the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s. That was just kind of what we were doing. A lot of processed food. But my friends who have been working out, strength training, maybe they were a high school athlete. I was, but I wasn't regularly strength training. I also have mentioned before in my podcast, I grew up primarily vegetarian. Mm-hmm. I was under eating on protein for the vast majority of our life. My friends that weren't under eating on protein and strength trained since they were younger and generally have a more muscular build, their total testosterone without any added testosterone inside, through prescription or patches or other stuff that's there, which we'll be talking about later on, they're in like the, 700, 800s. Mm-hmm. Not that it's a comparison,
right.
But it just shows that if you can be doing some of these things, not that testosterone is the end all be all marker that's there, how much more your testosterone can stay in a better range, most likely, for somebody who has not dropped the ball on weight training and eating adequate amount of protein.
Yeah. Yeah. It's super important. Yeah. And that you can, to your point, how you proved that you can modulate that, right?
Yeah. I'm excited to see what it looks like in another 5 years.
Yeah. Hopefully it'll just, if it doesn't go up, then hopefully it'll just hold steady and you'll prevent this kind of, loss over time that happens both from aging or decrease that. I don't think you can completely prevent it. It's a natural phenomenon. But mitigate the environmental exposures. So I think that's one big factor also of why testosterone drops over time in men is that we tend to be more sedentary the older we get, right? We're just not out there playing sports as much. You're sitting on the couch and you're watching football, TV, whatever it is, and so that's one big factor. So strength training is a huge factor of importance for so many different health reasons, and of course testosterone.
Let's talk about longevity. In preparation of today's episode, you put together an incredible document where you were going through all the data and references around testosterone and mechanisms and other things, and you have this whole section that you put together where you talked about cardiovascular risk, and I'd love to chat about that for a second. Cardiovascular risk, CVD, is the main reason that is the main chronic disease, if I understand correctly, in the United States that people die from. Is that accurate, right? Cardiovascular disease?
Absolutely, yeah.
And so, people think about cancer, they think about Alzheimer's. These things are all things, autoimmune, which you've talked a lot about as well. Of course, these chronic diseases are all there and present, but cardiovascular disease, it's still sort of the quote unquote bread and butter, so to speak, in terms of why we all end up dying. So what do we know about testosterone and its relationship to cardiovascular disease?
Yeah, so there's a couple of big killers out there in heart disease, heart attack, stroke. Those are the big ones we worry about. But then sort of what leads to that, right? Cholesterol imbalances, metabolic syndrome, high blood pressure. All these factors that lead in. So this is really interesting when you look at the research literature. And there's some things which are still kind of like, does testosterone help? Does it not help? What's the role for replacement, et cetera? This is one area that is not very controversial in a lot of ways, right? So we can see pretty clearly, over 100 different studies, that there's an increased risk of heart disease, atherosclerosis, cardiac events with low testosterone and with testosterone deficiency. And that when you replace testosterone, that the cardiovascular risk factors and events drop. Right?
And what do you think is going on inside of the body? Like, what do you think the link is? What kind of mechanisms are happening that low testosterone would actually increase your risk of a cardiovascular event?
It's complex, and there are many, right? So I think one of the central pathways is around inflammation. So inflammatory response and testosterone, the potential benefits there. I think another really important factor is the bidirectional relationship that, exists with metabolic syndrome, right? So we know that if you have diabetes or insulin resistance or metabolic syndrome, that can lower your testosterone, but it's also the other way. If you have low testosterone, you're at higher risk for those complications, So testosterone has such a central role in overall body metabolism, in strength, in muscle, in, and then the factors that then downstream lead into the cardiovascular health are quite interesting, quite impressive.
I want to pause for 1 second before we go into bone health, which is another thing related to longevity. Let's talk about women and testosterone. Sometimes people hear words like estrogen. They think, okay, that only matters to women. Testosterone, okay, that only matters to men. I don't know if this is accurate at all, but I once heard that testosterone is actually one of the most abundant hormones for women inside of their body as well too. Is that accurate? Do you know anything about that?
So it's definitely in lower amounts than in men, obviously.
Of course, but in terms of total hormones in a woman's body, is testosterone one of the key players that's there?
It is. Yes, absolutely. Not as much as estrogen,
sure,
or progesterone, et cetera. But no, absolutely key and super important for some of the same things that we talk about with men, especially libido, sexual response, mood, irritability, cognitive function, even a smaller estrogen especially, but a smaller role also in cardiovascular health for women as well. So when we have women doing, perimenopausal or, if they have low libido, we have them, trying some testosterone therapy. We use much, much lower doses. But there is a significant benefit, and especially in sexual response. And so you can even, if you have a prescription for some testosterone cream, you can apply it locally on the vaginal area and even on the clitoris, and that can really enhance sexual response and orgasm.
What do we know about bone health when it comes to low T and the risk of osteoporosis?
Yeah, so testosterone is critical in men and women for helping to maintain bone health and helping to prevent osteoporosis. And osteoporosis is a progressive bone disease. Over the course of our lifespan, we do tend to lose bone. You can protect this, obviously, from doing strength training, building, early athletic activities, et cetera. But there was definitely evidence to support that men with a testosterone deficiency do have an increased incidence of osteoporosis and experience fractures as well. So there's a variety of mechanisms there, that gets into sort of bone physiology, but testosterone has a variety of different receptor activity on different bone cells, on bone turnover, on osteoblasts, which are sort of the cells building the bone, and on osteoclasts, which are the turnover cells. They sort of chew up the bone, and the osteoblasts spit it back out again. And again, testosterone has some signaling there that can really be helpful.
As we age, and as I turn 40, and I've been talking a lot about sort of, even though that's like super young, and even 50s young and 60s young, if you live a healthy lifestyle, all these numbers, you're still so young, right? And you can age in a way where people look at you and they're like, wow, you are abnormally aging in a good way, right? So, but as we age, we're starting to pay attention more to, okay, our brain, if we're not fully dialed in, it is not working the same way that it
Yeah.
used to be.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we open this podcast with is how low testosterone, separate from being connected to low libido and difficulty in putting on muscle mass, is also impacts focus and mental cognition. So what are some of the things that you have put together and know about the relationship between testosterone and the brain?
Yeah, so super important, super area of deep interest. You've had one of the amazing researchers and writers in this field, Dale Bredesen, on as a podcast guest, and he talks a lot about testosterone and about hormones in general, estrogen for women, testosterone for both, as being trophic for the brain, as being sort of something. There's toxins, there's trophic things, there's something which you just need to have. You need to have it around in decent amounts throughout the lifespan. In order to have optimal cognitive function, optimal brain function, and an optimal opportunity to prevent early onset cognitive decline, dementia, all the way up to Alzheimer's disease, right? But just from on the day-to-day, 40s and 50s, we start to get potentially a little bit more spacey, or kind of forget where we put our keys, or but cognitively and on the brain, testosterone is super important for a lot of factors, spatial ability, spatial awareness, things like map reading and object rotation have been shown to be affected by testosterone. And then mood is a super huge area, right? So, feeling more kind of blah, feeling, more tendency towards depression,
not having that drive,
the, sort of the vitality, the, get up and go, the motivation, ability to focus, and so sort of like people might think they have ADD or ADHD, but that is also potentially influenced by testosterone, right? You just have this, ability to kind of put things together, to see the connections, to manipulate things cognitively and spatially in your brain, and to function optimally. And testosterone is really key. So that's really one of the most gratifying areas, I think, of working with patients with testosterone, low testosterone. They'll frequently, pretty quickly see a benefit on how they feel, how their body feels, how their body responds to workouts and exercises, but then also to energy, to mood, to just like, wow, I feel like I have myself back again. Like, it's kind of like, had forgotten what I used to feel like, and I had forgotten how good I used to feel, and just kind of accepted this sort of mediocre kind of like, humdrum existence that I find myself in, right? And so all those things, and then the memory piece, being able to recall more quickly, more clearly, those are some of the areas that I find. And then of course, the third one for, replacement benefits would be the sexual benefits, just feeling more alive, more aware, having better libido, so those are really, it's one of the areas of medicine that's really gratifying, because you can pretty quickly, within balance, get people back to what just feels right. It just feels like, wow, this is, I'm kind of, hey, I'm back, where was I? So
I actually want to come back to causes of low testosterone and things that either are directly or indirectly. You mentioned some of the big ones that were there: obesity, metabolic health, sleep issues. We talk about, processed foods being a big part of that. Are there other environmental factors separate from toxins that play, or that you feel, whether you have data or whether you're from your clinical experience, you think play a role? Like, does keeping a cell phone in our pocket as men, does that have a role in testosterone?
That's a great question. I have not actually looked in depth at, if there's studies to show that, because I do wonder about that front pocket versus back pocket. I also worry about women who are carrying their cell phone in their sports bra next to their breasts, or tucking it into their, workout, tights or whatever. And so it's right next to their ovaries, so I do wonder about that local effect of radiation EMF exposure, as well as the bigger picture fact that we are completely bathed in Wi-Fi signal, in EMF signals, in a completely unprecedented way. There's a really interesting article just in the New York Times a month or so ago, showing a visualization of the Starlink satellites going up, and just like sort of where we're at now. And I think there's like 4,000 to 5,000 or so, and they're gonna basically go 10 to 20x of that. And so it's just like this sea of these satellites just kind of beaming us with signal. So That's a bit of an area of controversy, right? There's some differing opinions on there, but I do think that EMF exposure does play a significant role in our bodies and our ability to function. I really don't see how it can't, because it's kind of a big experiment on us at the society level. Have you seen any studies on pocket and cell phone and
I haven't with
Yeah.
testosterone. I know that there are a few studies, and Andrew Huberman's covered this on his podcast that we'll link to in the show notes, but there's a few studies about sperm quality and cell phones in the pocket, and how just the heat alone coming from the cell phone can increase the temperature of the testicles and kill sperm.
Yeah.
And interesting about that, as somebody who's working on family planning and wants to start a family one day, is that there was a small drop when you moved your cell phone to the back pocket, but there was still a decline in sperm quality by keeping your cell phone in your pocket. Now, I don't know how big the study was. I don't know how many studies there were, but we'll link to an episode where Dr. Andrew Huberman, who's been a past guest of this podcast, covered a few of those data. But I'm not familiar with anything with testosterone. And yes, I'm untrained. I have no degree in medicine or health or anything like that. I definitely am worried about the level of, Wi-Fi, EMF, 5G, other things. But largely I know, outside of making my home a better environment for it, there's not a lot that I'm going to be able to do. And I'm so thankful that we have those things. We're sitting in our studio in Los Angeles, and that allows us to work, and our team and everything like that. So I'm going to double down. I'm going to pay attention to the space. I'm going to continue to learn from individuals like yourself who are staying on top of the latest science, but I'm going to make sure that I don't use it as an excuse to say, well, I might as well not do anything anyway, because I'm bathed in all this Starlink EMF and everything else like that. There's still so much that you can do. And it's even more of a reason to focus on the basics, because those things have such a protective effect on the body.
Yeah.
And I know you feel the same way.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And there's a variety. Yeah, I agree with you. There's a convenience factor, and, we all just live a virtual world. We're still practicing a lot of telemedicine, and, so Wi-Fi and internet connectivity, like it's vital. You can't do without it. And there's a whole, amazing, opportunity for areas in the world that don't have reliable access, and to be putting up satellites that can then provide internet access across Africa or India or wherever those areas are, and then really amazingly, impressively help those populations live better lives, right? But within our sort of Western, modernized, industrialized society, simple things. You can choose to turn off your Wi-Fi at night. You can, don't have your cell phone on your bed at night for so many reasons, but especially for, that potential of EMF exposure, and not just the Wi-Fi or the cellular signal to the phone, because, please, if you do have your phone next to you, put it in airplane mode at night. But plugging it in and having that charger cord running, definitely has, an EMF footprint to it. If people want to look at this in more detail, you can purchase home EMF meters for a couple $100 on Amazon. There's some good ones. And you can just kind of walk around your house and look at where the biggest fields are, right? The biggest EMF fields. So, but yeah, get your devices out of your bedroom, please, if you can.
You sent us a bunch of really interesting images when it came to the role of testosterone in different aspects of the body. Let's bring one of those up and kind of talk about some of the insights that you can glean from them. What about this first one about diet, fat, endotoxins, and testosterone? Let's bring that image up on the screen. And then for those that are listening, if you could describe it and sort of what are some of the findings that you are walking away with from this image?
Yeah, so this is a really cool study. And this kind of goes back to your first question a minute ago, which was what are some of the other factors that can contribute, right? So to lowering testosterone, of which there's a long list, and we can kind of rattle them off and go in depth on a few if we want to, time allowing. But this was a study that looked at obesity and low testosterone, and pointed to the fact that there's a link between inflammation and low testosterone and obesity, which we knew. But they really point out the fact that there's this link with intestinal permeability. And so intestinal permeability, colloquially known as leaky gut, where our intestinal cells should be, have tight junctions and be nicely opposed to each other. And then our body gets to decide what comes in and what doesn't. But when we have inflammation or toxins or gut disruption or SIBO or mold or infections, whatever it is, though autoimmune, food sensitivities, etc., those cells will become more permeable and allow a variety of different substances to leak in now and gain exposure to the systemic circulation and the systemic immune system, with a huge feedback loop of inflammation. And if you have intestinal permeability, you're also going to have increased blood-brain barrier permeability. They kind of go hand in hand because of this sort of toxin cytokine soup that gets set up inside the body. But this study has this model that they showed where high-fat, high-calorie diet leading to obesity alters the gut microbiome, leads to a breakdown in the mucosal barrier. You now get exposure to what's called endotoxin or lipopolysaccharide, LPS. This is bacterial toxin which now can leak in, trigger the immune system, triggering what they call a metabolic endotoxemia. And then this toxins actually has direct effects in the Leydig cells of the testicle where testosterone is produced, activating these interstitial macrophages, these immune cells, and then inhibiting these enzymes, these steroidogenic enzymes in the testicle, right? So more oxidative stress, decrease of these enzymes which are used to produce testosterone, affecting then, creating basically a lower testosterone production linked to your gut balance, right? Super fascinating. And then, basically these reduced levels of intratesticular testosterone, this oxidative stress that gets set up, you then see impaired spermatogenesis, reduction of sperm quality, reduction of sperm count. And then this whole feedback loop also centrally, in addition, that's local to the testicles, with this inflammation, with this metabolic endotoxemia that gets set up from the intestinal permeability, you can have direct, downregulation at the level of the hypothalamus and the pituitary on that central signal of luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, to then produce testosterone. So it's multifactorial. So really interesting, right? The gut, as we believe, is really the center of the universe when it comes to health. And it's just pretty fascinating to see this kind of a really kind of linear connection being made related to our hormones and our testosterone.
Yeah, it really just showcases how important our total lifestyle is.
Yeah.
And when we get super far away from it, we're not talking about, some saturated fat in the diet that's coming from largely cleaner sources and whole foods, even if that means animal products. They're talking about a high fat, high calorie diet. Again, to me, that's ultra processed foods, and that impact that it plays on the gut, and that to think that our gut health has a direct link with our testosterone. And through the explosion of ultra processed foods that we've had over the years, it's another reason why you're not surprised. You're definitely shocked, but you're not surprised to see that there's been this major drop in testosterone levels.
Yeah, it's one big factor. And I think also just, one thing I love seeing in articles like this is that they pull out this idea and they show this connection between, intestinal permeability and then the downstream effects on the hormones. And they're really just talking in this one article about obesity and ultra high fat processed foods, et cetera. But what you and I know and what functional medicine practitioners know is that there's so many other triggers for intestinal permeability that are activating this same pathway.
What are some examples?
Right. So any kind, microbiome imbalances in general, that can also be any hidden infections. We're very aggressive in our practice about doing comprehensive stool testing. We actually frequently send 2 separate labs at once to different companies to look for hidden infections that we can treat. SIBO.
And that would be like a parasitical infection, for example.
Yeah. So parasites, common ones that we'll find, Giardia, Cryptosporidium, Blastocystis hominis, which is, a little bit of nuance there. Some mainstream GI docs would say that that's more of a commensal pathogen and maybe not necessarily a triggering inflammatory pathogen that you have to eradicate, but it's strain dependent, and we don't really have a great ability to test which strain it is. So we do tend to like to try to eradicate that, especially if people have symptoms. Blasto has been shown to be connected to fatigue and to joint pain and to, gut symptoms in general, bloating, gas, etc. So those are a couple examples. SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, very, very common. We test everybody for this at the start gate in our practice. You also have SIFO, small intestinal fungal overgrowth. You can have environmental mold exposure, which is irritating your mucous membranes and causing a variety of different mucous membrane symptoms, including intestinal permeability, toxins, heavy metals, antibiotics, environmental pollution exposures. The list goes on. Stress, sleep disruption, those all contribute to intestinal permeability. So, the gut being super central and all the factors then that lead in are really important to address.
Super important.
Again, it's complicated, right? So I hope we're not losing people out there, meaning like, wow, I really want to address this and I think it might be a problem, but like, whoa, I don't know if I can do all that, So I would say, knowledge is power, right? So just kind of realize that, again, there's all these things that we can work on that are working against us if we don't pay attention to them because they're just present in our lives, in our environment. But try not to get overwhelmed, find the right people and the right team to work with and then get the support that you need because making lifestyle change is not easy. And so working with a really comprehensive care team, which is what we've really been brainstorming and trying to build and using any angles in there just to like get people the support that they need when they need it. So it doesn't feel too overwhelming so they can be successful, week on week, month on month, year on year about locking those changes in so they can live their best life.
Yeah, that's what we want for everyone. I want to come back to this idea that when it comes to testosterone, there's more awareness than ever, social media, other things, and just this massive decline. And for a lot of people, the car analogy that you had was perfect. I have so many friends that are not so super health oriented. Even friends that are like executives at other companies or founders that are like, oh yeah, I need to go get testosterone replacement therapy. And there's so many nuances that are there. And I'd love to just chat about that for a second because you're talking about all the complications that kind of come in. You brought up one nuance before we started recording, which is you're talking about how something like fixing your sleep and sleep apnea actually plays a role into whether or not you or somebody else might consider for a patient, whether or not getting replacement therapy would be a good idea or not. So could you talk about that?
Yeah. So it's again, in functional medicine, in this work that we do, and that you and I both live in this space, it's a network effect. It's a systems effect. The body is constantly communicating across different systems, and there's this interplay, this bidirectional information flow, right? And so we know that having low testosterone can lead to, we see this image here, it can lead to disrupted sleep. It can lead to more arousal. It can lead to less deep sleep. It can lead to decreased sleep efficiency, sleep fragmentation, right? And so
more arousal, less arousal.
Thank you. Less sexual arousal, but more nighttime sleep disruption
just
arousal.
General arousal,
yeah, you're like,
not in a sexual context.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you're more likely to wake up at night and then have trouble falling back asleep, or just be restless, or be moving around a lot in your bed. If you use a wearable at all, you can see that. So you'll see a lot of movement and a lot of micro arousals, not sexual. We're not talking about sexual. So thank you. That's a very good clarification on that one. And so that is there's a lot of overlap there with sleep apnea, right? And so, it can kind of push you over the edge of potentially, having that condition or that diagnosis. And there's, a lot of effects that can lead into that, from having low testosterone, right? But in addition, then having obstructive sleep apnea has all those factors and more. Inflammation and hormone disruption can then also directly lower your testosterone. So it can be this negative feedback loop that happens. And if you're not dealing with both, the potential for the optimal outcome for, managing that condition for you is lower, right? It's also very important, if you're going to start testosterone therapy, that you screen people for sleep apnea, because starting testosterone therapy, I think we have an image for this as well, from this study out of the World Journal of Men's Health. There's a variety of factors where if you give somebody testosterone and they had sleep apnea, but you didn't know it, you could potentially worsen the sleep apnea. You could have them have more symptoms, and there's a variety of physiological reasons for that. With starting testosterone, you can have decreased contraction of your airway dilator muscles. You can have, therefore, increased upper airway collapsibility, decreased ventilatory response, increased metabolic requirements, leading to more oxygen consumption and therefore using up more oxygen, which could exacerbate sleep apnea, right? So, you want to screen people. The easiest way to do it, and I would like everybody who's listening to this, when they're done, we can link it in the show notes, hopefully, go out and just go online and find this questionnaire called the Stop Bang questionnaire. And it's just like a pretty easy to do. It'll just take you a couple minutes, and it will give you basically your risk factor potentially for sleep apnea. So, if you screen medium or high on that, you should absolutely be evaluated, right? There's so many reasons that sleep apnea is potentially dangerous for you, from hormone level we're talking about, but also metabolic, inflammation, high blood pressure, just cardiovascular risk, huge downstream negative effects of having sleep apnea. But again, if we're going to start testosterone, we want to make sure we know, so we'll screen them with a Stop Bang. It's a variety of different questionnaires, but then also do either a home sleep test. There's a couple that we like a lot, either a watch form factor device or a ring, not the Oura Ring. This would be a device called the Sleep Image, which has, a real-time SpO2 monitor for your oxygen levels, and it measures your heart rate and your heart rate variability based on your pulse and your movement, through gyroscopes, etc. So you can get a really nice snapshot of what your sleep looks like and how fragmented it is, and your oxygen levels relative. So the nice thing about these devices is they'll map your oxygen level on one graph against your heart rate. And so if you see, a lot of times if someone has problems getting enough oxygen at night, right? So, a lot of people will call this sleep disordered breathing. We like to flip that around and call it breathing disordered sleep, because how you breathe during the day, all through the day and especially at night, absolutely affects your sleep and your sleep quality. But if you drop your oxygen level in the night, you will see a compensatory sympathetic stress nervous system response with a spike of your heart rate. And so you can see this really nice kind of, contiguous graph where you'll see those matching up. And that can be a really, really nice way to diagnose.
So your heart has to work harder to get the oxygen that it needs, essentially, because somebody might have an obstruction or something's going on. They might be snoring.
Partly that, for sure. Yeah, you're getting hypoxic, your oxygen levels are dropping, your heart has to pump faster. But it's actually worse than that. It's more complex, meaning your body kind of sees that drop in oxygen and goes, oh, no, this is bad. And so you get this huge flood of stress hormones. So you're getting this constant spike of your cortisol during the night when it shouldn't be. Wow. When it should be much more balanced. And that's basically just this constant drain on your adrenal cortisol production, which then leads to adrenal fatigue or adrenal burnout, or, adrenal, those are terms we don't love as much, but basically adrenal dysregulation. So drop out of your cortisol response, right? And then a huge downstream negative effect from there. So,
wow. So we've been talking a lot about what goes wrong with the body when testosterone levels are low, and especially chronically low. What do we know about how to bring them up and what plays a role? So let's talk about the first aspect, which is diet, right? And in diet, there's a few different categories. The first category we've sort of touched on, which is just generally moving away from ultra-processed foods, excess calories from ultra-processed foods. For some people, especially too, even a high-fat diet, even if it's not ultra-processed, if their gut is really messed up, potentially looking at that, maybe getting a stool test done, working with a doctor, because even a high-fat ketogenic diet for some people could be creating a lot of endotoxemia.
Yeah.
I was one of those individuals. When I did keto pretty hardcore for about a 7-month period of time, for the first time in my, after being in my 20s, when I stopped having acne, which was largely from dairy, I started having acne and breakouts and little pimples that would come over my body. And it was working with a microbiologist who's a friend of mine, been on this episode before. He's like, I think you're having an endotoxemia reaction to a high saturated fat diet. You should move towards, if you're going to do keto. This was, many years ago, like 2016, 17, 18. He said, you should move to a more cleaner keto. You could still eat higher fat, but in particular, the saturated fat, your body may not be doing really well with at the levels that you're having. And
What were some of your fat choices at that point? Where did you switch to?
I was doing a lot of grass-fed beef at that time. And I was moving away from that towards more mono unsaturated fats, olive oils, avocado oils, things like that. Leaner cuts of protein that were there. And I stopped adding in, sort of ridiculous amounts of MCT in my diet. And that seemed to do the trick.
Nice.
Right. I'm not on a ketogenic, diet right now. I don't fear fat and I don't demonize any sort of macronutrient groups that are there. I have a much more balanced approach now to the whole process and the learning lessons that were there. But yeah, diet, after we've gone away from excess calories, ultra processed foods, dialing in the right sort of diet for you in particular, are there things that we know about dietary choices that can help us increase testosterone levels?
Yeah. So a couple of just sort of big picture tenets is, on this is that you want to have the optimal information coming into your body that your body across all different systems can use for its different functions, right? So really nutrient density is a really important concept, sort of eating food closest to its actual natural state and in as much of a nutrient dense way as possible. So, minimizing grains and pastas and cake, cookies, crackers, etc. Even if especially actually if they're gluten-free, because the gluten-free alternatives are frequently less healthy, except for the gluten factor, than their counterparts, because they have all sorts of sugar and additives and binders, etc. So nutrient density, and then eating a wide variety of fruits and vegetables. So we call this eat the rainbow. So when you eat fruits and vegetables of different colors, you're getting this huge amount of different antioxidants and phytonutrients and phytochemicals, which our bodies again have evolved with and understand and need in order to build hormones, in order to optimize the adrenal function, in order to optimize the enzyme function for processing all these hormones and for getting them into their active states in order to decrease inflammation, right? Another really critical tenet that we've touched on is glycemic balance, right? Eating for metabolic balance and to lower insulin resistance. So avoiding a lot of sweets and sugars, and if you're going to have something that's sweeter, matching it with some fat or protein that then slows how quickly that moves into your body. Really basic concepts, but really, really surprisingly important, right? And then on top of that, making sure that you're getting foods that give you the nutrients that you need, right? So things like zinc and magnesium and B vitamins and folic acid and vitamin D, and we can go into any of those in a little more detail if we want. But those are the key things, some of the key things that you need to have optimal hormone balance, along with most other systems, right? So those are some of the basics, and then I would definitely obviously add the intestinal permeability piece and the gut inflammation and the microbiome. I love the episode you did with Dr. Will Bolshevitz on fiber, right? So soluble and insoluble fiber, the effects that has on our beneficial gut bacteria, on our butyrate producing, short chain fatty acid producing bacteria, how that's anti-inflammatory in the gut, but also throughout the whole body. All these things have a key effect. And so lots of different levers.
When you are working with a patient, and let's say they've gotten a lot of these basics covered, but their testosterone is still generally low and it's matching with a lot of the symptoms that they're telling you. Like they don't have strong sexual appetite or libido. They feel like they have a harder time putting on muscle at the gym compared to when they were a decade ago. They may not feel that drive. Drive is actually the biggest one that I've seen when, my peer group, especially my friends that are older than me, are starting to question and wonder if they need to start doing some sort of intervention when it comes to testosterone. That tends to be one of the biggest ones. Yeah. That and probably like sexual libido.
Yeah.
When do you, and let's say they're focused on the basics, their sleep is dialed in, their diet is generally the things that you've mentioned, right? When do you start to consider whether or not or how do you consider if they should be adding in some sort of testosterone replacement therapy?
Yeah, so it's very individual. It's very N of one for each person. Depends on their level of motivation, their resources, both in terms of time and brain function and energy and financial, and how long can they, what's their runway, how distressing is this, or are they okay kind of going for the slower but more in-depth wins. So you mentioned diet, you mentioned sleep. We want to optimize exercise also, make sure that's optimal strength training, not overdoing cardio, which can be a drain on testosterone, not overtraining, mindfulness, stress reduction, all those pieces. So we try to get all those lined up, and if we can do that and then retest and even start them on some testosterone support supplements or work on their adrenal gland functioning after we've tested that with special tests, and then kind of see, do the levels naturally rise? Because you showed that, right? 10% rise of testosterone just doing that one piece of more strength training, right? So it's actually kind of impressive what you can achieve. But if they're up for that, great. And if they say, you know what, I'm going to do all that, and I need quicker results because I'm underwater here, and things are not working, and it might be struggles at home and marriage, relationship with the kids, with job, etc. So at that point, depending on the labs, depending on the symptoms, we might jump in sooner. So it's a kind of an individual thing with each person, where we work with them. I like to kind of use any condition, and especially this testosterone. It's kind of like a gateway diagnosis, if you will, meaning like, hey, we have your attention now. You're here, you're talking to us, you want help, you recognize there's a problem. Yes, let's work on that problem, but let's also kind of like sneak in like sort of Trojan horse, like some of this other work that will really help you to, really extend your health span, your longevity potentially, right? And so kind of tailor it to their unique concern at the moment, but also try to build those habits so they're just much better set up for the rest of their lives. But again, we have to respond to their immediate needs as well. So it's a little bit of a dance.
Because generally, would you say that, it's not like everything is perfect and then just your testosterone is off?
Correct.
Chances are there's something else
that's
going on in the body
always something else
that has to be paid attention to.
Always. Yeah, and it also depends on the levels on the lab, right? So if they're really struggling and their levels are super low, we'll go quicker, we'll move quicker, because we know that, yes, we can do all those lifestyle pieces and really it'll help, but you'll only see sort of a certain percentage of improvement that might not get them over that, sort of symptom line of where now they're really starting to feel it, right? Because you want people to feel better. You want to feel better kind of quickly so that they're engaged and it's a win for them.
And generally, would you say that, for a male in their 50s, they might respond better to some of these lifestyle interventions generally than somebody who might be in their later 60s or 70s, where their body may not have, they could do the same lifestyle interventions, but just again, through aging, they may not respond as well in terms of an increase. Is that generally?
I would say generally, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, but again,
obviously there's a lot of variation.
Yeah, individual, one-on-one, but it also flips the other way too. Like some of the younger people who are struggling actually, can respond, either not respond well to the lifestyle or respond super well to the lifestyle. Mm-hmm. I think some of when you're younger, there's definitely a lot of other comorbid conditions that can be occurring that can be contributing to low testosterone. Some of the obvious ones, obviously, we've talked about, like sleep and light exposure and stress and kind of overworking, et cetera. But sedentary lifestyle, poor diet, not enough movement, all these pieces can have a surprising benefit too. So it's we definitely see those helping in older folks too, right? It just kind of really depends. If it was you and you are showing up in 15 years, but you're like have been so savvy with all lifestyle pieces, then yes, I think that's gonna be potentially less of an incremental boost. But if it's someone who's like has not really looked at these things and is overweight or pre-diabetic, and you put them on a 30-day nutrition reset and you get them sleeping and get them doing some mindfulness, it's pretty actually impressive of like the turnaround you can create from lifestyle. We showed that with some of our work with first responders and firefighters. We put them through a 4 to 6 month long program where it just really locked in. First month was nutrition and diet reset. The second one was sleep, and then third month was recognition and command of stress, and then metabolic health, and then toxins. And we put a bunch of wearables on them and did labs pre and post, and did DEXA scans pre and post to look at body composition, and we're able to show a really interesting shift in the physiological markers, right? So HRV improved dramatically, resting heart rate dropped dramatically, and then redistribution of body composition. Not even like so a good amount of weight loss, but that wasn't the whole story. It was definitely like a redistribution from fat to muscle too.
That's incredible. Let's talk a little bit about replacement therapy. What are the options that people have available to them? There's been some innovations in this space over the last little while. There's more awareness that's there. So what typically would be the way that you would, once you've decided to work with somebody, they've done the basics, they are incorporating straight training, there's still a delta between where they want to be, where you want them to be, and most importantly, how they feel. How do you think about prescription interventions? What's on the table? And then in terms of approach and dosing, how do you like to think about that?
Yeah, so there's like 5 or 6 or so main options, right? Definitely by far, I think the top 2 are either an injection form or a topical form, a cream or a gel. There's also patches, there's pellets that can be put in that can, last for several months. There's, a sort of buccal, inside your cheek treatment. There's even some pills. We don't really use the pills at all. There's concerns around toxicity. And most of the time we're just focusing on either an injection or a gel. And, there's pros and cons on each side. The injections, the conventional recommendation was to sort of give a shot every 2 weeks. That's, pretty antiquated because, you have this really long, sort of, drop of the testosterone level. Then you get sort of a sharp rise. It comes up within the first few days and then it starts to drop. And then you really have this long tail on the back end of that where you're not getting physiological testosterone levels. So probably more commonly will be once a week that some practitioners will do. We like to actually give the shots twice a week if possible. And so you kind of take a total dose and you divide it up into, that more frequent administration. We definitely prefer, a testosterone cypionate form. This has about an 8-day half-life. And so, if you give that twice a week, you can get into a really nice steady state on dosing and keep them at a kind of nice release level there. Probably, it depends on labs and response also, but probably then it would be about 40 to 60 milligrams per shot. And, it usually comes as a 200 milligrams per ml. So then you kind of get like a little insulin syringe and pull up a small amount and measure it pretty precisely that way. You can really dial it in quite well. And then you check the labs, you follow it, and you make sure that you're not overshooting, you're not undershooting, you track symptoms, you measure SHBG, you measure things like PSA, prostate specific antigen. So you kind of track and hemoglobin hematocrit to make sure you're not pushing into too much like erythrocytosis, like a too high of a level. Based on response then, based on symptoms, and then based on labs, you can dial it in that way. A lot of men really need to kind of get their levels up to the mid or upper range and keep them there for a month or two, or even a little bit longer before the benefits really start to kick in. So otherwise we'll frequently use a topical, a cream or a gel. You can get this compounded at a compounding pharmacy. You can kind of have it at any dose strength you want that way. Or there's also some commercial preparations that you can get, and so gels and creams work quite well. A lot of men like them because they don't want to be doing injections. The testosterone injection is a little bit of a thicker liquid. It's in some oil, so it has sort of like a time release factor to it. But because of that, you have to use a little bit of a larger sized needle. It's not ridiculous, but it's still giving yourself a shot at home, and there's variable acceptance or interest in doing that.
And typically in the belly area, like the
usually
fat
buttock,
on the sides,
buttock
buttock
or outer thigh is my preference. Yeah, and you like to rotate when you're doing it twice a week. You like to rotate sites too, so you don't saturate the receptors in any one site.
So a couple questions on that, that I got from my audience, in preparation of today's conversation. So there are people that are out there that sort of pride themselves on doing things naturally, and they want to do food first approach, and they want to focus on that. And sometimes it's hard for them to wrap their head around the fact that, well, on one side, they don't feel good and they've been focused on a lot of the basics. And maybe they've even met with a practitioner, or they have a feeling based on hearing other people's story that, it might be time for some sort of additional prescription intervention. Maybe, maybe not. That's why working with a great practitioner, can help you dial in. But there's this general concern that, oh, well, isn't this a reliance on something external, like a drug, a pharmaceutical, or something like that? What do you feel about that? And what do you tell patients who sort of come in with that concern?
Yeah, so by all means, if you want to, try all the natural things you can and see if that works. And there's also a bunch of different supplements that have potential support for hormones, testosterone. But again, if you kind of reach the end of that line and you're like really thinking, I'd like to, or should I, but you're concerned around, again, yeah, sort of taking over for the body or doing something that's not natural. Let's just talk again about how we started this podcast. Like, what's happening to our bodies is not natural, right? And we're kind of up against a little bit of a wall with regards to the stressors that we're putting on ourselves and the effects that has on our entire physiology and especially our hormones, right? And so I don't think it's natural to be at such a low level of testosterone as a population. And then especially if you start to stack symptoms related to that and you start to have those symptoms at a younger and younger age, because we know there's just tons of research out there, like we've talked about today, to support that. Sure, you could kind of go the quote natural way and not replace it, but then you're at higher risk of so many different adverse health outcomes, from brain health to heart health to bone health to mood and cognition and depression. So if you have any of those things, that's going to be a major impediment to living a fulfilling and long life, right? So it's definitely a balance of how much we choose to intervene. To the point of that question, though, I would also say, we try to be very middle ground with this, because there's some doctors, I've been to some conferences, and there's some medicals, in the functional integrative medicine space. You'll go to these conferences and a lot of doctors are doing this education for hormone health. And they're very, very aggressive with like dosing and levels and labs, and they're kind of pushing, sort of this more anti-aging, aggressive sort of replacement protocols, which I don't know if that's totally natural, right? And they're maybe doing it because they say, hey, well, we can do this, and why not, feel like what you did when you're 18. That's not my philosophy, right? I want people to age gracefully and to age healthily and to respect the natural processes that we all have as part of the arc of being alive on this planet, but also to do it optimally and to balance that and to prevent chronic disease. And again, to have that opportunity to have a long health span that mostly matches your lifespan, right? And so in that setting, I think judicious replacement of testosterone and other hormones, to levels which are physiological and we're not overshooting and we're tracking carefully, I do think it makes sense.
You mentioned supplements that could play a role. Can you talk about some of them? And then to what degree that these supplements can be impactful, and where there might still be questions, but they could be still generally supportive for other aspects of health?
Yeah. So there's kind of like a couple of categories here. There's like your general bucket of your sort of support stack that it would be good to be on in general, and especially if you're worried about hormone health. Those are a lot of things for around mitochondrial support. This is some of the very important early steps for testosterone synthesis pathways. But mitochondria are important for everything, right? For so many other processes, right? But just to go down the list quickly, things like R-lipoic acid, vitamin C, selenium, your B complexes, magnesium, manganese, copper, CoQ10, glutathione support, micronutrients, especially minerals. So zinc is a critical, a supplement, or you source it through foods. There's a variety of different excellent food sources of zinc that's really, really critical for testosterone production. And many of us are low in zinc, right? So zinc, and for testosterone synthesis, then making the testosterone itself, things like zinc and magnesium, vitamin D, again, your B complexes come in there, vitamins A, C, E, so these are antioxidants, right? Again, helping within the testicle itself to protect against oxidative stress, so that you can have optimal testosterone production. And so then from there, there's sort of a variety of different botanical medicines, nutrient supplements, which do have some research literature and some historical usage to support hormones. Things like maca, branched chain amino acids. You talked about that, super helpful. Betaine is a really interesting one. Betaine probably works around methylation and production, sort of recirculating, recycling, methionine, and also production of creatine. And there's definitely some very interesting evidence out there that betaine up to 5 grams a day can really help to increase testosterone, improve muscle mass. So you can get this, like trimethylglycine is a great source of that.
What about creatine itself?
Yeah, absolutely. I do prefer the betaine because I think it's farther back on the metabolic pathway, and your body can kind of decide what it wants to do with it better. Also, betaine is linked up frequently in supplements with as a betaine HCl, hydrochloric acid, which can have some benefits on your gut, on digestion, inflammation, intestinal permeability. So lots of benefits there.
When somebody has their diet dialed in, when they're getting their workout dialed in, and let's say they're getting that minimum dose of the 150 minutes a week, the strength training, and maybe like one HIIT workout. What have you generally seen about how much of a bump you can get from some of these supplements that you've recommended? Like, what should be expectation levels around it when it comes to testosterone?
Yeah, I think so. It's again very end of one, because it really depends on the individual operator and how they're dialing in all the different pieces. But let's just say it's someone like you, and it's pretty optimal, and they're doing a great job, and they're doing their strength training, and I would say it's probably on the order of 7 to 10%.
Okay, so that's a pretty decent bump.
Yeah, especially because again, it varies a little bit with sort of how depleted they were, or if they were low in zinc, or frankly low, or relatively, what those numbers look like, vitamin D, all those pieces. But yeah, it can be decent.
What are the other categories when it comes to testosterone that you feel that people come in and there's maybe either misconceptions around it, or a lack of understanding around it, or there's just that information that you have from having treated so many patients over the years that it's something that people just don't get about how vital it is, or how to access it, or how to support it? Is there something that comes up for you?
Well, some of the misconceptions out there, I think, are one big one is around prostate health. So there was some a lot of early discussion around potential risk of prostate cancer, and BPH, benign prostatic hypertrophy, and if you go on testosterone supplementation, that might trigger or cause either of those conditions. And what we know is that we now know this pretty well. This is what we call the saturation effect. So testosterone replacement does not cause prostate cancer. That's pretty clearly shown now. And but you can actually see some, if the person's testosterone levels are very low, usually like low 200s or so, the prostate itself is not saturated with testosterone. And if you do start testosterone therapy, you might actually see some growth of the prostate or some increase of the lower urinary tract symptoms. And so that could be concerning, obviously, right? And so if someone comes in, their testosterone levels are super low, we warn them about that, and we let them know this is a possibility. I want you to keep track of symptoms. We're going to track your PSA. We definitely absolutely get a baseline PSA as part of our screening labs, and then we'll follow that up and track that and make sure there's not a sequential rise, which would be concerning. But if someone's testosterone level is in the 300s or above, we actually don't see a lot of effect on the prostate. And so there's still a lot of holdover on that, of men coming in saying, hey, I think I might need this. I think I might want this, but I really don't want to do it because I don't want to get prostate cancer, et cetera. So there's some education there. And we talked a lot about the benefits on cognition and brain and neuroplasticity and all those pieces. But the research is also a little bit mixed there in terms of what the actual net effect on sort of day-to-day cognitive function is, and what the outcomes are. And I think it's just because there's just a lot of complexity of dosing, and sort of how high what levels they're targeting, and what the outcomes were there. We definitely see a benefit in our populations of that cognitive boost that happens. But there's that still being elucidated in the research of what that actually looks like.
Before we get into a case study that you have of somebody that you worked with, another question that I had regarding prescription testosterone, supplemental testosterone that people would add in. Once you go on it, is the goal to get people off, to stay on it? And even if you wanted to get off, let's say if you raise your testosterone significantly, could you get off? So how do you think about that, and what education do you provide to people that you work with?
Yeah, so I think in general, most people will usually get on it and decide to stay on it relatively long term.
Because at
And
that point in time, if they've gotten on it and they need a prescription intervention, chances are they kind of have needed that for a while, and their body will continue to need that.
right, absolutely, yeah. And they'll then usually reap the benefits of being on it, and they'll feel good, and they'll not want to lose that, right? And so then it becomes, they're motivated to keep going. But we do sometimes have people, for whatever reason, that they need to get off of it, which you absolutely can do. We ideally like to taper people, because there is some, especially if you've been doing injections or creams or sort of a exogenous replacement, there definitely is some down regulation of the central systems in the body, right? From the hypothalamus to the pituitary to the testes, et cetera, where the body says, hey, it looks like everything's good and we have enough testosterone, and, so we don't need to produce that much, right? And so, in general, that can come back online. Sometimes the local production of the testosterone in the testicle itself, which amounts to about 5% of total testosterone production, that one is variable on how much it comes back. And so that's an important point also with younger men who are still desiring fertility. There's a lot of factors there. You can get, changes in local testosterone in the testicles, which can affect sperm production and fertility. So, if we don't like to put men who still desire fertility on either a testosterone injection or a gel, but assuming that's not a concern. Slow taper. Sometimes you can get that back, and then again, really dialing in the lifestyle factors.
You have a case study that you have for us. I think it's a 46-year-old man that you worked with in your clinic. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. Yeah. So it's a great case. Kind of just goes through a lot, brings to life a lot of what we've been talking about. This is a man named Jonathan. He had been experiencing fatigue and low libido and difficulty maintaining an erection. He was feeling frustrated about his inability to gain muscle in the gym. He had some extra weight around his belly and, a little bit of borderline high blood pressure, right? And so, kind of a typical 46-year-old guy, has a full-time career, which he really enjoyed. He was loving it. But it was really stressful. It was really competitive. So you need to kind of maintain that drive. 3 kids at home, school-age kids. Wife also worked full-time. And they're also, caring for his mom, his elderly mom who had dementia. So just kind of like all burners firing, right? So, we basically did everything that we talked about today, right? So he came in, we did a bunch of intake forms. There's a couple of questionnaires. One of them is called ADAM, ADAM. Androgen deficiency in the aging male, and you can get a score on that and sort of see like what's your potential, your likelihood, possibility. He scored pretty high on that, especially for a couple of key questions on there, which are really key us into this being a concern. We did a bunch of testing on his gut. We tested for SIBO, nutrient deficiencies, his adrenal hormone function, his testosterone, PSA, all those hormones as well. And so basically, we came back to him and said, hey, this is real. There's definitely concerns that we have. His labs showed increased markers of inflammation. He had a number of different nutrient deficiencies. He did show, blood sugar imbalances, sort of this metabolic derangement that we've talked a lot about today. He had an imbalanced GI system. He had SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, right? And his testosterone levels were frankly low. His total testosterone was 215 nanograms per deciliter. And it's important also to mention that we do like to measure testosterone in the morning in a fasting state, right? So that's when we get the most accurate measurements. And so, we would, again, really like to see him at the mid-level or higher, ideally above 500 on that. And so, basically, kind of dialed in, I actually sent him links to the Will Bolshevist episode with fiber. We got him, eating more fiber, having regular bowel movements. We had him hydrating. I showed him your sort of hydration boot camp, episode that you did, and worked first on his gut and, got his bowel movements happening better, treated his SIBO, got him on some nutrient support, talked about his sleep, optimized that. He worked really closely with our health coach. We actually did run that sleep image study that we talked about today. We had him use a wearable to track his sleep, so we could kind of get some data on that, and then just put him through some basic sleep hacks, that are really effective and really key. He was also sort of a hyper cardio exerciser, training for long distance runs. And so, we had him keep doing some cardio for the health benefits, but also pushed him and encouraged him more into strength training, weight training, all these pieces, right? So full spectrum, right? All these different pieces.
And I don't know if you mentioned it, but when he first came in, his testosterone, if you could mention the number.
Yeah, 215.
215.
Yeah, so low. Yeah.
Very low.
Yeah. Which is eye-opening to him too.
Right.
I mean, it's so fun on our side to do this work and to have somebody like him come in and, he's just like, go, like doesn't really basically have time to think about how he's feeling, but he's starting to get this sense like, gosh, it's just not, it's just, I feel heavy. Like I just feel energetically heavy and I'm just feel slow. And it's like, I feel like I'm kind of wading through, quicksand, just slipping back all the time, and so then we get, him in, we do this deep dive, we start building these lifestyle habits with him. We show him data across all these different, areas. And that's like kind of my favorite visit with people, right? The first visit is great because it has like in general, people have had trouble usually finding someone who would do a deep dive and really think about this and with their health issues with complexity and nuance. But then when we come back and we say, look at all these things that are contributing to what you're experiencing, and it's real. So you kind of see this like weight lift and his shoulders drop a little bit. And, he's like, okay.
People feel validated.
I knew there was something going on, right? And so, and not only that, but that we now have things we can do about it, right? So it's really gratifying work. So, again, lifestyle pieces, got him all dialed there. He worked with our health coach and our nutritionist. We got him on a bunch of supplements and adaptogenic herbs for his adrenals. We put him on some, testosterone precursor hormones like DHEA and pregnenolone. And we worked with him like just with that over about 4 to 6 months, and he actually saw some really interesting gains. His testosterone with all of that went up by 200 nanograms per deciliter.
Wow.
Right. And so now we're in the low 400s. He lost about 10 pounds of weight. His energy was better. His libido was improving. It wasn't kind of back to what he would like or where he felt like, he could be. He had some increased muscle, mass gain, and he was generally feeling pretty happy. Right. And as were we, and appreciating that he did a lot of that hard work. Right. And so then we reevaluated, we got some, reset the labs, new baselines. And then we did start a testosterone prescription. But again, we were able to do it at a relatively lower dose because it wasn't the only tool that we were using, right? And so we were able to kind of use it as sort of like an extra spice, a little, extra, on top. And with that, it kind of took him over the edge of sort of, really feeling like he got his mojo back. He was back feeling very vital, feeling, able to make decisions more quickly, able to juggle all the things that he was juggling, and so that was really fun.
That's great. Do you know where he ended up after, that last sort of boost?
Yeah. So he's about in the 600s in terms of testosterone level, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's kind of holding in the mid 600 range. And to him, that feels great.
Yeah. And most importantly, he feels good.
Feels great.
That's awesome. It's amazing how, again, it's not just that this conversation is about testosterone, but we're using that as sort of the opening for so many other aspects. As you mentioned, his body composition improved, his mood improved, all these areas improved in sort of, in his life. And it just shows you what's possible when you focus in on something and you pay a little bit of attention. And again, you work with the right team, you get some labs done so that you actually know what's going on inside your body. And then you take action. It's not something that somebody else can solve for you. You can have your testosterone levels brought up to normal, even optimal from just prescription alone. But if you don't put in the work that's there, you're going to have challenges on other sides of things later on. Sure, you might have high total testosterone, but you could have other issues that impact your longevity. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And what really gets me passionate about this stuff too is like, here's this guy, this 46-year-old guy who came in and, sat down in front of us and we were able to start working together. And over the course of 6 to 9 months, we're really able to shift his experience of his own body, of his own life. That's awesome. Love that. That's a win for him and for us, right? Everyone's feeling good. But what really gets me is like just this big picture thing, right? Like if he never had landed in front of us, or he didn't hear about functional medicine, or he didn't understand, like there is something I want to dig deeper on here. There's something that's not quite right. If he just settled for the status quo, I believe, right? I believe, that his life in 15 years, in 20 years, hopefully he lives that long, 30 years even, would look very, very different than it has the potential to look, right?
Mm.
And so it's kind of like this fork in the road, and where it's partly about the immediate wins, but it's really much more about this sort of opportunity to live your optimal life and to try, in a really creative and very structured and very scientific and evidence-based way, try to roll back some of the negative effects that are just pushing down on us all the time, the environmental exposures and the toxins and stressors and all the things that we all deal with, right? So it's kind of like, I feel like, and I'll ask you if you agree with this, but I almost feel like we don't really have a choice anymore, right? There's so much coming at us that, we have to get more proactive. And, I guess the choice, if you don't, is you just settle for, you're just going to be one of those numbers of people with chronic disease, those numbers which are dramatically rising every month and year, and you're just going to kind of settle for being sick, right? So, but you don't have to.
Yeah, you're really asking, like, are you just trying to make it through the day, which, okay, you might be alive, that could be survival, or are you trying to thrive? And when you thrive, all the goals and dreams in your life that you want to put love and attention on, they get better and you can actually accomplish them. Let's do a little bit of a recap. We've been going for about an hour and almost 40, 50 minutes. Let's do a recap so we can kind of put all these pieces together. And if there's anything that we missed, feel free to, interject and we can give you space to be able to cover it. So there's both the short-term and long-term reasons why we want to pay attention to low testosterone levels. Can you share some of those short-term and long-term reasons again before we go to the next one?
Yeah. So short-term, that you can feel your optimal potential, you can have better focus, you can have better energy, better vitality, you can maintain, body composition that feels good, that sleep optimally, so many different factors.
And some of the long-term.
Yes. So preventing long-term negative outcomes like heart attack, like stroke, like atherosclerosis, like lipid abnormalities, blood pressure abnormalities, basically being able to potentially roll back some, maybe not all, but some of the cardiovascular risks which are tied to testosterone. We talked a lot about cognitive, about your optimal brain function, about your ability to think clearly and have the best possible spatial awareness and memory, and potentially help to maintain that trophic level of testosterone, of hormone, which is part of what's going to help us prevent dementia or cognitive decline or even Alzheimer's disease, right? Things like bone health. So there's many.
And it's normal as we age, right? Especially for men, that your testosterone will decline. What we're talking about in general is this specific abnormal decline. When you look at these cohorts of people, even not that long ago, back to this graph that we shared over here from the European Urology Journal, even in the 2000s, we saw that the average testosterone levels of every cohort, 15 to 19, 20 to 29, 30 to basically 40 years old, all of those have significantly dropped since, the data that they have there of 2015 to 2016. So something is going on. And in particular, you have highlighted some of the main root causes that you feel that are contributing to that if you could recap those.
Yeah. So stress, sleep disruption, artificial light exposure, gut disruption, intestinal permeability, exposure to toxins, in our water, in plastics, heavy metals, mercury, lead, et cetera, arsenic, cadmium, air pollution, all these factors play a key role. And just to go back to what you just said before about the levels, absolutely, having your testosterone decrease over time is part of natural aging, and it's physiological, right? And is associated with negative health ramifications. And so even in that group, taking away any of those concerns that we have, there are potential benefits to supporting testosterone to a balanced level. But then you stack on top of that, all of this sort of, newer, stressors and triggers that are pushing on our bodies over the last 20, 30, 40 years. And yes, we're now pushed into an even more severe drop and decline and potential negative outcomes on our hormones, as well as many, if not most, other health issues.
And as part of the recap, it doesn't have to be this way.
Does not have to be this way.
Even if you find yourself in a older age group, 40, 50, 60, 70, it doesn't have to be this way. You can make some serious gains in your increase in testosterone, which obviously benefits your entire life. And some of those things that are lifestyle tools that are available to us are, if you could recap them.
Yeah, absolutely. So eating a healthy diet, getting optimal nutrition, nutrient-dense foods, as clean as you possibly can, organic whenever possible. I just saw a really great seminar by Mark Houston talking about integrative and functional medicine for cardiology, for lipids, for blood pressure, for CHF, cardiovascular disease, plaque formation. He says he will not eat anything that's not organic. So maybe not, we don't all have that luxury in terms of availability and cost also, but as much as possible, look at the environmental working group, look at the dirty dozen and the clean 15, which foods, the dirty dozen are ones that you really should only eat organic, et cetera. Choosing the healthiest animal proteins, et cetera, et cetera. There's many opportunities there. So nutrition, number one, balanced sleep, balancing your stress, and movement, exercise, and within the stress category, mindfulness, breathing, breath work, qigong, tai chi, restorative work as well. So
yeah, those are all beautiful things, and with a little bit of a extra focus on, especially adding in, if you're under muscled, that lean muscle mass to improve body composition, to make sure you eat a diet that supports that component, and to not only see the testosterone go up, but to feel, stronger in your body, which has a whole bunch of,
that's the most important thing. Just feeling the feeling that you get. Yeah. You feel better.
And then if you have the basics covered and you still need some interventions, you can look at the tools that are there, like supplemental testosterone, right?
Yeah. Supplemental dietary supplements, herbal medicines, nutrients that help with conversion and production of testosterone. Make sure your zinc levels are good. Make sure your vitamin D levels are good. Magnesium, et cetera. And then, yes, absolutely, in the balanced and judicious way, working with somebody who can help you to optimize your testosterone using, what feels like the right prescription method for you, can be really helpful for a lot of people.
Amazing. Well, this has been fantastic. Anything else that you feel in your incredible preparation for today's episode? Anything else or final words that you want to leave the audience with when it comes to this topic of testosterone?
Yeah, I mean, I think we touched on it during the podcast, but I just want to highlight it again, which is that you always do such a good, amazing deep dive with your guests, and we go through so much information, and so I think it's valuable, and I think it's really critical to put that information out there for people, but I don't want people to get overwhelmed. I'm notorious for wanting to do everything all at once, and it can be kind of overwhelming, right? It's just a lot. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of lifestyle stuff. It's a lot of things to take. It's a lot of things to buy, testing to do, et cetera, et cetera. So, if you're curious about this but on the other hand, you're feeling like that just feels like too much, just do one thing at a time. Just do one small change. Look up, the previous hydration episode and just start drinking more water in the morning. See how you feel. Just try being off your screens at 8 o'clock for a couple of weeks. Don't even commit to forever. That might feel too overwhelming. Just do it for a week. Do it for 2 weeks. See what you notice. If you're using any kind of a wearable device, look at that data. Just kind of see what those incremental changes do. And you can kind of sort of step by step back into this, right? It doesn't have to be a sprint, right? Hopefully you will live for a long time to come. And if you make small changes, over time, you will see the benefits of it. And so it doesn't have to be, everything all at once, right? That's actually, if you try to do it that way, you're really likely to fail, right? Because it's gonna feel overwhelming. It's not your natural rhythm. It's not your natural habit, and so you'll give up, right? It's like the New Year's resolution, right? So go slow, make it sustainable. Work with a team who knows how to do this, who believes in you. Get a health coach. Find some community and friends who are also curious about this. And that way you'll really have some success in building it into your life.
Amazing. Speaking of team, if people want to reach out to you and your team and you want to work with you, you guys obviously do telemedicine in a bunch of different states that are there. Where do they go and how do they get in touch with you?
Yeah, so we're the California Center for Functional Medicine, and our website is ccfmed.com. For anyone listening out there, under our programs tab, we actually do have a webinar and a Q&A that we put up. Also, there's an ebook up there on men's health and testosterone, which is free. So you're welcome to log in and grab that. And we also have a service called the Functional Medicine Checkup, which is a low-cost $500 2-visit sequence where we do a deep dive on blood test labs and kind of get you started on the path of this work. So if it feels, again, too overwhelming, it's just a really easy, quick way to start. But again, we're just passionate about trying to change people's lives one by one and trying to change the impact that chronic illness has on our society and on our healthcare system. So yeah, reach out if we can be of any help.
That's awesome. They'll get the basic snapshot of what's available to them with a little bit of guidance as well, right? Some basic lifestyle things,
Yep.
things that most people can do just from the comfort of their own home.
Yeah.
Without a lot of cost intervention to sort of start heading in the right direction.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. All those labs, zinc, copper, vitamin D, deep dive on lipids, looking at the particle number and the submarkers, that show us sort of the lipid ecosystem, so yeah, there's a lot of really interesting information that can come out of that.
Amazing. We'll link to that in the show notes at ccfmed.com.
Correct.
Where you can find out more about the California Center for Functional Medicine and all your great work and your team's work. Dr. Sunjya, this has been fantastic. Thank you for the breakdown and the little masterclass that you took us through on testosterone. I learned a bunch and I hope the audience did too. So I always appreciate you coming on the show and sharing your knowledge with us.
Yeah, Dhru, it's been great to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity. And it's just fun to sit down and chat with you and go through a deep dive on this really, really important topic.
Hey, YouTube, if you enjoyed what you just saw, keep watching for more great content on how to improve your brain and your life.
It's like a magic looking glass. When you see inside your abdomen, you get a perspective you've never seen before. You're not accustomed to it. And so that's a really good chance for you to form new habits.